During the spring festival of Beltane, when flowers bloomed across the northern kingdoms, a child was born who would reshape the very fabric of reality itself. The year of her birth remains a matter of some debate among chroniclers, with sources placing it variously between 1251 to 1253. Her name was Cirilla Fiona Elen Riannon, though the world would come to know her simply as Ciri. She entered existence as the sole Princess of Cintra, a kingdom perched on the edge of the Great Sea, known for its military might and the iron will of its rulers. Her mother was Pavetta, Princess of Cintra, a woman who possessed strange and terrible powers that manifested when her emotions ran high. Her father was a man known only as Duny at the time, a cursed knight who bore the head and body of a hedgehog during daylight hours, only taking human form when darkness fell. But Duny was more than he appeared. He was, in truth, Emhyr var Emrys, the future Emperor of Nilfgaard, the vast southern empire that would one day sweep across the continent like a tide of black armor and golden sunbursts. The circumstances of Ciri's conception were themselves woven into the threads of destiny. Years before her birth, Duny had saved the life of King Rogner, Pavetta's father, when he found the monarch badly injured in a Cintran forest. In gratitude, and bound by ancient custom, Rogner invoked the law of surprise, promising Duny something he possessed, but did not yet know he had. That unknown possession turned out to be Pavetta herself, for the princess was already pregnant with her, though Rogner remained ignorant of this fact. But there was another twist in this tangled web of fate. At that same fateful banquet where Duny claimed his reward, a white-haired witcher named Geralt of Rivia stood among the guests. When violence erupted and Duny's life hung in the balance once more, it was Geralt who intervened, using his enhanced reflexes and silver sword to save the cursed knight from those who would see him dead. In turn, Duny invoked the law of surprise once again, this time binding his unborn child to the witcher. Neither man knew at that moment that Pavetta carried a child within her womb, but the ancient magic that governed such oaths cared nothing for their ignorance. Ciri was now bound to two destinies, two fathers, two paths that would pull at her throughout her life. Her early years were spent in the golden halls of Cintra, under the watchful and fiercely protective gaze of her grandmother, Queen Calanthe. The queen was a legendary figure, known across the continent as the Lioness of Cintra, a warrior queen who had led her armies to victory time and again. She was beautiful, brave, and utterly devoted to her granddaughter. But she also carried a secret, one that would haunt her family for generations. Through Calanthe's bloodline flowed the Elder Blood, an ancient elven genetic inheritance that granted its bearers powers far beyond those of ordinary mages. The Elder Blood, known as Hen Ishhair in the ancient tongue of the elves, was the result of centuries of careful breeding by elven sages seeking to create a being capable of opening the Ardgath, the gates between worlds. The bloodline traced back to Lara Doranap Sheadal, a powerful elven sorceress and daughter of King Oberon Murkatak of the Aen Elle. Lara had been destined to marry the elven sage Avallok, creating a child who would wield unimaginable power. But she fell in love with a human mage named Cregananavlad, choosing passion over duty. She bore him a daughter named Rhiannon, and the carefully cultivated elder blood passed from the elves into human lineages. The gene was unpredictable, sometimes skipping generations or splitting into latent forms that could lie dormant for years before combining once more. Through marriages and centuries, it found its way into the royal houses of the northern kingdoms, Calanthe herself carried it, though she showed no signs of magical ability. Pavetta, however, was different. At her betrothal banquet, when her beloved Duny was threatened, her powers exploded outward in a maelstrom of chaos magic that tore through the hall like a hurricane. Ciri was only an infant when tragedy struck. While she was still too young to remember, her parents set sail from Cintra, intending to bring her with them on their journey. But the ship was caught in a terrible storm, and both Pavetta and Duny were lost to the hungry waves of the great sea. Their bodies were never recovered. The official story declared them dead, victims of nature's fury. But the truth was far darker. Years later, it would be revealed that Duny had conspired with the mage Vilgefortz to fake their deaths and transport the family to Nilfgaard. Pavetta, however, discovered his true intentions and secretly arranged for Ciri to remain behind with Calanthe. When Duny realized Ciri was not aboard the ship, a violent argument erupted between husband and wife. In the chaos, Pavetta fell overboard into the raging waters. Whether she was pushed or fell during their struggle remains ambiguous, but the result was the same. Vilgefortz's magic then teleported the ship away with only Duny surviving, leaving Pavetta to drown in the sea. Duny would later claim to Geralt that she simply fell, but the Witcher's response suggested he believed otherwise. With Pavetta dead, and his identity as Duny no longer needed, Emhyr var Emrys returned to Nilfgaard to reclaim his throne. With her parents gone, Ciri was raised by Queen Calanthe and her uncle, though Calanthe's protectiveness bordered on obsession. The queen knew about the law of surprise that bound Ciri to the Witcher Geralt of Rivia, and she despised it with every fibre of her being. When Geralt came to Cintra 6 years after Ciri's birth, hoping to meet the child who was bound to him by destiny, Calanthe refused him utterly. She would not even tell him the child's gender, let alone allow him to see her. The queen tried to have Geralt imprisoned, viewing him as a threat who would take her beloved granddaughter away to become a witcher, subjected to brutal training and dangerous mutations. She saw only a monster hunter who would corrupt her precious Ciri, never understanding that destiny would find its own way, regardless of her interference. During these early years, Ciri lived a life of relative comfort and privilege, though she was also trained in the ways befitting a Cintran princess. She learned statecraft, history, and the arts of war, for Cintra valued martial prowess above all else. But she was also sheltered, kept safe within the walls of the castle, unaware of the greater forces that swirled around her existence. She knew nothing of the elder blood that ran through her veins. She knew nothing of the prophecy spoken by an elven seer named Ithlinne, which foretold that a child of the elder blood would either save or destroy the world. Everything changed when Ciri was still a young girl, barely old enough to understand the horror that was about to descend upon her homeland. The Empire of Nilfgaard, under the command of Emperor Emhyr var Emrys, launched a massive invasion of the northern kingdoms. Their armies were vast, disciplined, and ruthless. They swept through kingdoms like a scythe through wheat, leaving devastation in their wake. Cintra, proud and defiant, stood in their path. The slaughter of Cintra, as it would come to be known, was a brutal and terrible affair. The Cintran army fought with courage and ferocity, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Nilfgaardian forces surrounded the capital, and the siege was short and merciless. Queen Calanthe, the Lioness of Cintra, fought until the very end, but she knew the battle was lost. Mortally wounded and facing capture, she made one final, desperate decision. She called Ciri to her side. The young princess found her grandmother bleeding, dying, surrounded by the chaos of a collapsing kingdom. With her last breaths, Calanthe told Ciri to flee, to find Geralt of Rivia, the witcher who was bound to her by destiny. She told her granddaughter that Geralt would protect her, that he was the only one she could trust in the dark times that were coming. Then, rather than face capture and humiliation, Queen Calanthe threw herself from the castle window, choosing death on her own terms. Ciri, traumatized and terrified, fled the burning capital. In her fear and desperation, her latent powers manifested for the first time. She let out a scream of pure anguish, and the very fabric of reality seemed to respond. Objects shook and vibrated, energy rippling outward from her in waves. It was a mere hint of what she was capable of, a fraction of the power that lay dormant within her blood. She escaped into the refugee camps that had formed in the wake of Nilfgaard's advance. Thousands of displaced people huddled together, trying to survive as their world crumbled around them. In one of these camps, Ciri met an elf named Dara, and together they tried to stay hidden from the Nilfgaardian soldiers who were searching for her. For Emperor Emhyr, though no one yet knew his true identity, was desperate to find his daughter. He sent his most trusted agents to scour the land, chief among them a knight named Kaer Morhen ep Cialach. Kaer wore a distinctive helmet adorned with black wings, and he pursued Ciri relentlessly through the chaos of war. He nearly captured her multiple times, and his black-winged visage would haunt her dreams for years to come. But each time, Ciri managed to slip away, driven by fear and desperation and the faint hope that somewhere out there, a white-haired witcher named Geralt was looking for her. The concept of destiny was not a gentle thing in the world where Ciri lived. It was a force as real and tangible as the ground beneath one's feet, though far less predictable and far more dangerous. The law of surprise was an ancient custom that predated written history, woven deeply into the cultural fabric of the northern kingdoms. When someone saved another's life or performed a deed of extraordinary significance, they could demand as payment something the saved person possessed, but did not yet know they had. More often than not, this turned out to be a child, conceived, but not yet revealed. Such children were called children of surprise, gifts of destiny itself. Geralt of Rivia had invoked the law twice in his life, and both times the result was the same child. The first was at Pavetta's betrothal feast, when he saved Duny. The second came years later during a contract. He had saved a merchant's life, and in frustration with inadequate payment, invoked the law almost as a jest. Only later did he discover through complications that this child, too, was Ciri. Destiny had a sense of humor, but Geralt was no fool, and he understood the weight of what destiny demanded. Witchers were mutants created through horrific trials involving deadly toxins and magical processes. They were sterile, long-lived, and widely hated. To become a witcher meant surviving the trial of the grasses, which killed more often than not. Survivors emerged with cat-like eyes, enhanced reflexes, and extended lifespans, but also as something no longer entirely human. For years, Geralt tried to deny his connection to Ciri, convincing himself he had no need for a child of surprise. But destiny cared nothing for his reluctance. When Geralt first encountered Ciri face to face, it was in the ancient forest of Broccolin, ruled by the Dryads. Ciri, then just a young girl seeking adventure, had wandered into the forest and become lost. The Dryads were an ancient race of women who survived by kidnapping girls and transforming them through their sacred spring. They had found Ciri and were preparing to make her one of their own. Geralt tracked her there. When he found her, she was threatened by a giant centipede dwelling beneath the trees. The Witcher slew the monster with practiced efficiency. He should have taken her then, but Geralt made a choice that would haunt him. He returned Ciri to Cintra, convincing himself the child would be better off in the castle than on the path with him. But destiny would not be denied so easily. When Cintra fell and Calanthe lay dying, her last words to Ciri were to find Geralt of Rivia, to seek out the Witcher who was bound to her by fate. The Queen, who had fought so hard to keep them apart, finally understood that only Geralt could protect her granddaughter from what was coming. After the fall of Cintra, Geralt searched desperately for Ciri. He tracked rumors and whispers, following the faint trail of a young girl who matched her description. He scoured refugee camps and questioned survivors. The weight of his failure pressed down on him with every passing day. He had denied destiny, turned his back on the child he was meant to protect, and now she was lost in a world tearing itself apart through war. The search took him through devastated lands, past burned villages and mass graves. He fought monsters and men alike, always asking the same questions. Had anyone seen a young girl with ashen hair? Had anyone heard news of the Princess of Cintra? More often than not, the answers led nowhere. Ciri seemed to have vanished like smoke on the wind. But fate, patient and inexorable, was at work. Through a series of events involving another invocation of the law of surprise, Geralt found himself working as a guard for a merchant and his family. The merchant had no idea of the Witcher's true purpose, knowing only that he had hired skilled protection for his caravan. It was purest chance, or perhaps the machinations of destiny itself, that this same merchant had found Ciri wandering alone after her escape from Cahir. He had taken her in, offering shelter to a traumatized child who seemed to have lost everything. When Geralt and Ciri finally came face to face in truth, there were no dramatic revelations, no thunderous acknowledgement of destiny fulfilled. She was hiding among the merchant's family, and he was simply doing the job he had been hired to do. But when their eyes met, something fundamental shifted in both of them. The connection that had been forged by fate years ago suddenly became real and tangible. This time, Geralt did not turn away. He accepted what destiny had given him, not with resignation, but with a determination that surprised even himself. He took Ciri under his protection, and together they set out for the one place where she might be safe, where she could learn to defend herself in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. They journeyed to Kaer Morhen, the ancient keep of the Witchers, hidden deep in the mountains where few could find it, and fewer still could reach. The path to Kaer Morhen was treacherous, a winding road through mountain passes known to Witchers as the Killer. Young Witcher trainees had died on this path over the centuries, victims of the harsh weather and the dangerous creatures that lurked in the peaks. But Geralt guided Ciri through with patience and care, teaching her the basics of survival as they traveled. He showed her how to move quietly through the wilderness, how to build a proper campfire, how to distinguish dangerous plants from safe ones. These were simple lessons, but they were the foundation upon which everything else would be built. During their journey, Ciri began to understand what it meant to be bound to a Witcher by destiny. She learned that Geralt was not the cold-hearted monster that many believed Witchers to be. He was gruff and often distant, uncomfortable with emotions and sentiment. But beneath that exterior was a man who cared deeply, who felt things perhaps more intensely than ordinary humans precisely because he tried so hard to suppress those feelings. She also began to learn about the world beyond Cintra's walls, a world more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. Geralt spoke to her of the monsters that plagued the land, creatures born of magic and mutation. He told her of the drowners that lurked in murky waters, waiting to drag the unwary into the depths. He described the neckers that swarmed in underground nests, vicious and cunning in their group tactics. He explained the griffins that soared on thermal currents, powerful and territorial. Each monster had its weaknesses, he told her, and a witcher's job was to learn them all. But he also spoke of a different kind of monster, one that wore human faces and walked on two legs. He told her that in his years walking the path, the greatest evils he had encountered were not the creatures with claws and fangs, but the men and women who chose cruelty and violence. Monsters could not help what they were. Humans had no such excuse. As they drew closer to Kaer Morhen, Ciri felt both anticipation and fear. She did not yet know what awaited her in that ancient fortress, did not understand the trials and training that would reshape her into something new. All she knew was that for the first time since Cintra fell, since her grandmother died and her world shattered, she felt safe. The white-haired witcher walking beside her had become the anchor in a storm that showed no signs of ending. The road to Kaer Morhen took them through the valleys of Cadwyn, past fortified towns and isolated villages. Everywhere they went, Geralt's appearance drew stares and whispers. Witchers were not welcomed warmly. They were tolerated at best, useful for clearing out monster nests, but otherwise treated with suspicion and contempt. Ciri saw how people crossed the street to avoid Geralt, how mothers pulled their children close when he passed. She began to understand the loneliness of the path, the isolation that came with being something other than human. Finally, after weeks of travel, the massive gates of Kaer Morhen rose before them. The keep was ancient beyond reckoning, built by the first witchers centuries ago. It stood at the end of a narrow valley, surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. The walls were thick stone, weathered by countless winters. Many of the buildings had fallen into disrepair, damaged during the sacking of Kaer Morhen, a dark chapter in witcher history when an angry mob led by mages and priests had attacked the fortress, slaughtering the teachers and students they found within. But the keep still stood, and within its walls waited the few remaining witchers of the School of the Wolf. Vesemir, the oldest among them, served as the fortress's keeper and teacher. He was ancient, his face lined with centuries of experience, but his eyes were sharp, and his skills had not diminished with age. Then there were the younger witchers, Lambert, sharp-tongued and often angry at the world that had made him what he was, and Eskel, kind and thoughtful despite the terrible scars that marked his face. These men would become Ciri's first teachers and guardians during that winter. They welcomed her to Kaer Morhen, not with suspicion, but with curiosity and a certain awkward warmth. She was the first girl ever to train within those walls, and they were not entirely sure how to handle her presence. But they recognized in her the same quality that Geralt saw. She was a survivor, and she had the potential to become something extraordinary. The winter that Ciri spent at Kaer Morhen was unlike anything she had experienced in the gilded halls of Cintra. The ancient fortress was cold, drafty, and filled with the echoes of ghosts, both literal and metaphorical. Snow piled high against the walls, and the wind howled through the mountain passes with a voice that seemed almost alive. But within those crumbling walls, surrounded by witchers who had themselves been forged through pain and hardship, Ciri began to transform from a frightened princess into something far more formidable. Her training began simply enough. Vesemir, the old witcher who served as master of arms and chief instructor, started with the basics of physical conditioning. He woke her before dawn each morning, leading her through exercises designed to build strength, endurance, and flexibility. Push-ups, pull-ups, running through the snow-covered courtyard until her lungs burned and her legs trembled. It was exhausting work, but Ciri threw herself into it with fierce determination. She had watched her kingdom fall. She had seen her grandmother die. She would not be helpless again. As her body grew stronger, the real training began. The witchers taught her their fighting style, a unique approach to combat that blended sword work with acrobatics and tactical thinking. During that first winter, it was primarily Eskel, Lambert, and Vesemir who worked with her, teaching her to move with fluid grace, to dodge and weave rather than block and parry. She practiced forms for hours each day, her movements becoming smoother and more precise with each repetition. The witchers were patient teachers, but they were also demanding. They pushed her to her limits, and then beyond, knowing that in real combat, there would be no mercy for weakness or hesitation. The training equipment at Kaer Morhen was specifically designed to forge witchers capable of superhuman feats. One of the most infamous pieces was the pendulum, a massive spiked weight that swung back and forth over a series of evenly spaced poles. On one side was a sheer drop into nothingness. The trainee had to hop from pole to pole while the pendulum swung past, its spikes close enough to disembowel anyone who mistimed their movements. It required perfect balance, precise timing, and absolute focus. At first, Ciri could barely manage a few steps before falling. The poles were too narrow, the pendulum too fast, her balance too uncertain. But the witchers did not allow her to quit. Day after day, she returned to the pendulum, learning through repeated failure. Bruises covered her body from the falls, but gradually, slowly, she improved. After weeks of practice, she could navigate the entire course. After months, she could do it blindfolded, relying on sound and spatial awareness alone. By the time winter began to thaw into spring, she could hop around the poles, perform flips mid-air, and dismount with a backflip, all while the deadly pendulum whistled past her with inches to spare. The training dummies were another crucial component of her education. These were not the straw-stuffed figures used by common soldiers, but heavy, weighted forms that taught proper striking technique. Ciri learned to hit with maximum force while maintaining perfect form, to target specific weak points on an opponent's body. She practiced until her arms ached and her knuckles bled, until the motion of drawing her sword and striking became as natural as breathing. But physical training was only part of what it meant to be a witcher. Vesemir also taught her the intellectual aspects of monster hunting. She learned to identify creatures by their tracks, their habits, their preferred environments. She memorized the alchemical properties of various plants and minerals, understanding which ingredients could be combined to create potent potions and oils. She studied the bestiary that witches had compiled over centuries, learning the weaknesses and behaviors of everything from simple drowners to rare and deadly creatures like fiends and leshens. Geralt took a personal interest in her sword training. He was more talented with a blade than perhaps any witcher alive, and he poured that knowledge into Ciri. He taught her not just the forms, but the philosophy behind them. A witcher fought differently than a knight or common soldier. They faced opponents who were faster, stronger, more numerous. Victory came not through brute force, but through preparation, timing, and exploiting weaknesses. He taught her to observe her opponents, to look for patterns and habits, to turn an enemy's strength into a liability. Lambert, despite his often caustic personality, taught her practical survival skills. He showed her how to set traps for animals and monsters alike, how to navigate using the stars and landmarks, how to find water and shelter in hostile terrain. His lessons were punctuated with bitter commentary about the world and the thankless nature of a witcher's life. But beneath the cynicism was genuine skill and hard-won wisdom. Eskel, scarred and gentle, taught her about empathy and control. He helped her understand that not every monster needed to be killed, that sometimes the real monster was the human who had created the problem in the first place. He shared stories from his time on the path, tales of moral ambiguity and difficult choices, preparing her for the reality that right and wrong were often matters of perspective rather than absolute truth. As the winter progressed, something unexpected happened during Ciri's training. She fell into a trance after accidentally consuming white seagull, a potent alcoholic beverage favored by witchers. In her altered state, she began to speak prophecies, her voice taking on an eerie, otherworldly quality. She spoke of deaths yet to come, of sorrow and loss, of fates written in blood and snow. The witchers listened with growing unease as she foretold events that would later come to pass. It was the first clear sign that Ciri was not simply a princess learning to fight. She was something else, something that transcended their understanding. Triss Merigold arrived at Kaer Morhen in December, over a year after Ciri had first come to the fortress, summoned by Geralt to help with Ciri's increasingly strange behavior. Triss was a sorceress of considerable skill, beautiful and knowledgeable in magical arts, and she came to the fortress with some trepidation. She half expected to find that the witchers had subjected Ciri to the trial of the grasses, the deadly process that transformed boys into witchers. She was prepared to intervene forcefully if necessary, to prevent such a thing from happening to a young girl. But what Triss discovered was far more extraordinary and far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Through careful observation and magical examination, she identified that Ciri was a source, a being who served as a living conduit for magical energy. Sources were rare and powerful, but they were also unstable. Their magic could manifest unpredictably, often triggered by strong emotions. Without proper training, a source could be a danger to themselves and everyone around them. During this second winter at Kaer Morhen, a new witcher joined them. Cohen, from the School of the Griffin, came to spend the winter with his brothers of the Wolf. He was a thoughtful, kind man who bore unusual scars from childhood illnesses like chickenpox, suggesting he had either contracted diseases early or begun his witcher training later than most. He grew a beard to hide these scars. Cohen brought different techniques and perspectives to Ciri's training, teaching her precise economical movements, emphasizing efficiency over flourish. His style complemented what the others had taught her, filling in gaps and providing alternative approaches to the same problems. He also formed a warm bond with Ciri, often spending quiet time with her when the others were occupied. Triss conducted a test, giving Ciri an elixir that would trigger a prophetic trance, allowing the sorceress to examine her magical abilities more closely. What she found terrified her. Ciri's power was not the controlled, directed magic that sorceresses wielded. It was something older, more primal, connected to the very fabric of reality itself. When Triss attempted to form a psychic connection with Ciri during the trance, she heard a voice speaking in elder speech, the ancient language of the elves. But this voice was concealed behind layer upon layer of magical barriers, protections so powerful that even Triss, skilled as she was, could not penetrate them. Exhausted and somewhat shaken by what she had discovered, Triss delivered her assessment to the witchers. Ciri's power was beyond anything Triss could safely teach or contain. She needed instruction from someone far more experienced, someone with the knowledge and skill to help her control abilities that could potentially reshape reality itself. Triss advised Geralt to seek out Yennefer of Vengerberg, one of the most powerful sorceresses on the continent, and not coincidentally, Geralt's former lover. The suggestion created a complex emotional situation. Geralt's relationship with Yennefer was legendary in certain circles, a tempestuous affair marked by passion, betrayal, separation, and reunion. They loved each other deeply, but their relationship was complicated by pride, independence, and the fundamental differences in their natures. Geralt had not seen Yennefer in years, and the thought of asking her for help, of putting himself in a position of need, was uncomfortable at best. But for Ciri's sake, he swallowed his pride. As spring approached and the snow began to melt from the peaks around Kaer Morhen, Geralt wrote a letter to Yennefer. It was not an easy letter to write. He explained the situation with Ciri, the discovery of her nature as a source, the need for training beyond what Triss could provide. He carefully avoided making it sound like a plea, though that was exactly what it was. He signed the letter and sent it by magical means, then waited with a mixture of hope and dread for Yennefer's response. While they waited, Ciri's physical training continued. The Witchers had come to care for her deeply, though they showed it in their own gruff ways. She was not like the boys they had trained in the past. She was quicker to laugh, more openly emotional, unashamed of tears or joy. She brought a different energy to the ancient fortress, something that had been missing since the sacking of Kaer Morhen had driven away or killed the younger generation of Witchers. There were lighter moments during that winter as well. The Witchers taught her their card game, Gwent, and she proved to be a surprisingly skilled player, beating even Lambert on occasion. They shared meals together in the Great Hall, telling stories of their adventures on the path. Some stories were funny, tales of mistaken identities and absurd situations. Others were darker, chronicles of loss and failure. Through these stories, Ciri learned that being a Witcher meant living with the weight of impossible choices, of doing what needed to be done, even when every option led to pain. She also learned about the history of the Witchers themselves. Vesemir told her of the glory days, when Kaer Morhen bustled with activity, when dozens of boys trained within its walls. He spoke of the intricate alchemical knowledge that had been lost when the keep was sacked, formulas and techniques that could no longer be replicated. The creation of new Witchers had effectively stopped after that dark day. The Witchers who remained were the last of their kind, a dying breed in a world that had never truly appreciated them. The attack on Kaer Morhen, Vesemir explained, had been led by mages and priests who viewed Witchers as abominations. They had whipped up mob fury, convincing common people that the Witchers were stealing their children and performing dark rituals. In truth, the law of surprise had been the primary method of recruitment, but nuance and truth meant little to an angry crowd. They had stormed the fortress, overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers. Most of the younger Witchers and their instructors had been killed. Only a handful escaped, Vesemir among them. Ciri listened to these stories with growing understanding. The Witchers were outcasts, hated and feared, despite the service they provided. They protected a world that despised them, hunting monsters so that common people could sleep safely in their beds. And now she was being trained to join their ranks, to walk the path as they did. It was a sobering realization, but it did not deter her. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. She had seen what happened to those who could not protect themselves. She had lost her family, her home, her kingdom. She would not be helpless again. As winter gave way to spring, Yennefer's response finally arrived. She would come to help with Ciri's training, but not at Kaer Morhen. The fortress was too isolated, too lacking in the resources needed for proper magical education. Instead, they would travel to Ellander, to the Temple of Melitele, where Ciri could receive a more conventional education alongside her magical instruction. It was not the answer Geralt had hoped for, but it was an answer, and it meant that Yennefer was willing to help. The decision was made. When the mountain passes cleared enough for travel, Geralt, Ciri, and Triss would leave Kaer Morhen and make their way to the temple. It would be a long and potentially dangerous journey, but it was necessary. Ciri had learned much during her winter with the Witchers, but there was still so much more she needed to know. On the morning of their departure, the Witchers gathered to see them off. Vesemir gave Ciri a small medallion, a wolf's head emblem similar to those worn by Witchers. It was not official, he told her, as she had not undergone the mutations. But she had earned it through her dedication and skill. She was one of them now, in all the ways that mattered. Lambert, in his typically gruff manner, told her not to get soft while living among the temple folk. Eskel simply embraced her, his scarred face creasing in a rare smile. Cohen saluted her with his sword, a gesture of respect between warriors. And Geralt, her teacher and protector, placed a hand on her shoulder and told her she had done well. It was perhaps the highest praise she could expect from the taciturn Witcher. As they rode away from Kaer Morhen, Ciri looked back at the ancient fortress, snow still clinging to its walls. She had arrived there as a frightened child, and she was leaving as something different. Not yet a Witcher, not yet a sorceress, but something in between. She carried within her the training of the wolf school and the latent power of the Elder Blood. She was Cirilla of Cintra, the lion cub, and her story was only beginning. The journey from Kaer Morhen to Ellander took them through lands still scarred by war. Nilfgaard's invasion had been pushed back after the stunning victory at Sodden Hill, where a group of mages and sorceresses had held the Southern Empire at bay. But the cost had been terrible, and the landscape bore witness to the carnage. Burned villages, abandoned farms, mass graves hastily covered with earth. The aftermath of war was not glorious or heroic. It was simply grim, a testament to humanity's endless capacity for violence. On the road, Triss fell ill, some malady or poison that left her weak and unable to ride. They were forced to travel more slowly, and eventually they joined a caravan led by Yarpen Sigrin, a dwarf merchant and commander, known for his loyalty and martial prowess. Yarpen's company provided safety in numbers, and the dwarf took an immediate liking to Ciri, seeing in her the same fierce spirit that he admired in warriors of any race. During the journey, Geralt told Ciri about the roses of Eilarind, a story that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Eilarind had been a young elven woman who led her people's youth in a hopeless rebellion against human expansion. She and her followers had ridden into battle, knowing they would die, choosing to make a stand rather than simply fade away. It was a tragic tale, but also one that spoke to the power of choice, of deciding one's own fate, even in the face of insurmountable odds. The caravan was attacked by the Scoia'tael, elven and dwarven guerrilla fighters who waged their own war against the human kingdoms. The attack was brutal and chaotic, arrows whistling through the air, steel ringing against steel. Ciri watched as Geralt moved through the combat with deadly efficiency, his silver sword a blur of motion. But she also saw the faces of the Scoia'tael, saw the desperation and anger there. These were not monsters. They were people fighting for what they believed was their survival, pushed to violence by centuries of oppression and prejudice. Later, it was revealed that the entire escort mission had been a trap. The northern kings, suspicious of Yarpen's loyalties, had used the caravan as bait to draw out Scoia'tael forces. Yarpen was furious at being manipulated, and Ciri learned another harsh lesson about the political machinations that governed the world. Trust was a rare and precious commodity, and even allies could not always be relied upon. They finally reached Elendor, a moderate-sized town built around the Temple of Melitele. The temple was a sprawling complex dedicated to the goddess Melitele, a maternal deity associated with healing, harvest, and protection. The high priestess was a woman named Yennefer, elderly and wise, who had known Geralt for many years. She welcomed them with warmth, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. The temple operated a school for girls from noble families, providing them with education in letters, arts, history, and religious studies. It was here that Ciri would receive her normal education, learning the things that any well-bred young woman should know. But her real education would come from a very different source. Yennefer of Vengerberg arrived at the temple some time after Ciri, and their first meeting was far from smooth. Yennefer was stunningly beautiful, with raven-black hair, violet eyes, and an aura of power that was almost tangible. She dressed in black and white, elegant and commanding, and she moved through the world with absolute confidence. But she was also prickly, proud, and accustomed to being the most intelligent person in any room. When Yennefer first looked at Ciri, she saw a girl with potential, but also with significant obstacles to overcome. Ciri, for her part, was immediately intimidated by the sorceress. Yennefer's beauty made her feel inadequate, gangly and awkward by comparison, and Yennefer's manner of speaking, clipped and often dismissive, did not help matters. The sorceress took to calling Ciri Ugly One, a nickname that stung even though Yennefer likely meant it with less cruelty than it sounded. Their relationship began with mutual suspicion and dislike. Ciri resented being talked down to, being treated like an ignorant child. Yennefer found Ciri's stubbornness and occasional naivety frustrating. They clashed frequently in those early days, their personalities grinding against each other like mismatched gears. But beneath the friction, something was growing. Yennefer, for all her sharp edges, was a dedicated teacher. She pushed Ciri hard, demanding excellence and accepting nothing less than complete effort. She taught Ciri the fundamentals of magical theory, explaining how mages drew power from chaos, the raw magical energy that permeated reality. She described the different schools of magic, the various ways that power could be shaped and directed. Ciri struggled with the academic aspects of magic. She had the power, that much was undeniable, but controlling it was another matter entirely. Her attempts at simple spells often went awry, producing unexpected or exaggerated results. Yennefer's frustration was palpable, but so was her determination. She would not give up on her student, no matter how difficult the process became. The other girls at the temple school were a different kind of challenge. They came from noble families, sheltered and pampered, and they were both fascinated and frightened by Ciri. Rumors about her past had spread, whispers about the fallen Princess of Cintra, who had somehow survived the slaughter. Some girls were friendly, others were cruel, forming cliques and spreading gossip. They teased Ciri relentlessly, jealous of the attention she received from Yennefer. One particularly painful incident involved the subject of magic and virginity. The temple girls, in their ignorance, told Ciri that only virgins could channel magical energy properly. This was completely false, a misunderstanding of certain metaphorical teachings, but Ciri believed them. When she confessed this concern to Yennefer, the sorceress laughed, a rare sound, and explained the truth. Magic had nothing to do with physical virginity. It was about mental discipline, emotional control, and the proper channeling of chaos. Ciri's education at the temple was broader than just magic, however. Yennefer insisted that she receive instruction in practical skills as well. She learned healing arts, how to treat wounds and illness, with herbs and natural remedies. She studied history, learning about the various kingdoms and empires that had risen and fallen over the centuries. She learned courtly etiquette, how to move in high society, though this skill seemed less useful than sword fighting or spellcasting. Triss visited occasionally, checking on Ciri's progress and offering her own insights. She was gentler than Yennefer, more patient and encouraging. Triss served as something like an older sister figure, someone Ciri could talk to about subjects that were difficult to discuss with either Yennefer or Geralt. The sorceress helped Ciri understand the changes her body was going through as she transitioned from child to young woman, topics that the witches had been entirely unequipped to address. There was a brief, uncomfortable situation at Kaer Morhen that Ciri only learned about later. Triss and Geralt had engaged in a brief romantic encounter during the winter, something that had left both of them feeling conflicted. Triss had genuine feelings for Geralt, but she knew he truly loved Yennefer. Ciri, in her youthful naivety, had felt a strange jealousy about the situation, not fully understanding her own emotions. It was one of many complicated interpersonal dynamics that she would have to navigate as she grew older. As months passed, Ciri's relationship with Yennefer underwent a slow transformation. The sorceress's harsh exterior began to crack, revealing depths of care beneath. Yennefer had her own tragic past, born with a twisted spine and hunched back, rejected by her family, sold to a sorceress who transformed her into the beauty she now was. But the transformation was only physical. Inside, she still carried the pain of that rejection. In Ciri, Yennefer saw something that awakened protective instincts she had never known she possessed. Sorceresses were typically sterile, an unfortunate side effect of their transformations. Yennefer had long mourned her inability to have children. Now she found herself filling that void. The girl became the daughter she could never birth. Ciri came to understand the woman behind the sharp words. She learned to see past Yennefer's defenses, to recognize the loneliness that drove so much of her behavior. When Yennefer called her ugly one now, Ciri heard it differently, recognizing it as something almost affectionate. Their lessons took on new dimensions. Yennefer began teaching Ciri about the political landscape of the world, explaining the complex web of alliances and enmities that governed the actions of kingdoms and empires. She spoke of the Lodge of Sorceresses that was forming in secret, a group of powerful women who sought to influence world events from behind the scenes. She discussed prophecy and destiny, and the dangerous game being played by those who sought to control such forces. Most importantly, Yennefer helped Ciri understand the nature of her own power. The Elder Blood was not simply strong magic, but something fundamentally different, a genetic inheritance granting abilities beyond what normal mages could achieve. But it came with terrible dangers. Prophecies surrounded the Elder Blood, predictions of destruction and salvation intertwined. Ciri learned that many wanted to control her because of this blood. Nilfgaard sought her for reasons still unclear. Various political factions saw her as a tool. Even the Lodge of Sorceresses was interested, viewing her as a potential piece in their elaborate game. Understanding this made Ciri feel less like a person, and more like a prize to be claimed. But Yennefer insisted that Ciri was more than her blood, more than her destiny. She was a person with agency, with the power to make her own choices. The world might try to use her, but she did not have to accept that role passively. This message became one of the pillars upon which Ciri would build her identity. The nightmares continued throughout this period. Ciri was haunted by visions of Cahir, who had pursued her through the ruins of Cintra. Yennefer would be there when she woke screaming, holding her, telling her she was safe. The Isle of Thanedd was a place of knowledge and power, home to Eredin, the most prestigious magical academy in the northern kingdoms. Built on an island in the middle of a lake, accessible only by boat or teleportation, it represented centuries of accumulated magical learning. The main tower, Torlara, stood tall and ancient, housing within its walls secrets that dated back to the time of the elves who had built it. Yennefer brought Ciri to Thanedd with a specific purpose in mind. A great conclave of mages was being held, a gathering of the chapter of wizards and sorceresses from across the north. These gatherings were rare and important, where the most powerful magic users would discuss matters of state, share knowledge, and engage in the complex political maneuvering that characterized their society. Yennefer intended to enroll Ciri at Eredin, believing that she needed more structured magical education than what could be provided at Elander. Before they reached the island, however, events took an unexpected turn. While staying in the coastal city of Gorsvelen, Yennefer met with Giancardi Molnar, a dwarven banker and old friend. The banker informed Yennefer that her financial movements were being tracked, that someone was monitoring her activities with great interest. This was concerning but not entirely surprising. Yennefer was powerful enough to have enemies, and information about her whereabouts was valuable to various factions. During this meeting, Yennefer allowed Ciri to explore the city, assigning one of Molnar's young employees to escort her. Ciri visited a menagerie, fascinated by the exotic creatures on display. But her presence drew unwanted attention when she inadvertently caused a disturbance. In a moment of excitement or fear, her powers manifested, creating a brief magical disruption. She used an emergency amulet Yennefer had given her to escape, teleporting herself away from the chaos. This incident attracted the attention of Tissaia de Vries and Margarita Loxantil, the former and current headmistresses of Eredin. They had been searching for truant students and stumbled upon evidence of Ciri's magical signature. When they tracked down Yennefer to discuss what had happened, they began to understand just how extraordinary Ciri truly was. But Ciri was not content to simply follow the path others had laid out for her. She was now a teenager, caught between childhood and adulthood, between the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. When she learned that Geralt was staying in a nearby town, she stole a horse and rode to find him, desperate to see the one person who made her feel safe and understood. Yennefer pursued her, and their reunion was marked by tension. Geralt and Yennefer had not seen each other in years, their last parting marked by harsh words and hurt feelings. But seeing each other again, with Ciri between them, something shifted. The three of them, together, felt right in a way that none of them could fully articulate. They formed a strange family, bound not by blood, but by destiny, choice, and love, that grew despite their best efforts to resist it. They travelled together to Thanedd, this odd trinity of witcher, sorceress, and princess. The island was magnificent, its buildings ancient and elegant, filled with mages from across the known world. The evening festivities included a grand ball, elaborate costumes, political maneuvering masked as social pleasantry. Ciri was overwhelmed by the spectacle, by the casual displays of magic that transformed the space into something dreamlike. During the evening, Geralt encountered various mages and sorceresses. One particularly notable conversation was with Vilgefortz of Roggeveen, a powerful mage who had led the defense at Sodden Hill and was now president of the chapter of wizards. Vilgefortz was charming and charismatic, but there was something about him that made Geralt uneasy. The mage spoke of an upcoming power struggle, hinting that Geralt might soon have to choose sides. The Witcher insisted on remaining neutral, unwilling to be drawn into political games. Dijkstra, the spymaster of Redania, also approached Geralt, attempting to recruit him for various schemes. The Witcher politely but firmly refused, maintaining his position of neutrality. But the very fact that such powerful figures were seeking his allegiance suggested that something significant was about to happen. In the early hours of morning, as the festivities wound down and exhaustion set in, chaos erupted. What became known as the Thanedd Coup was a carefully orchestrated attack led by Dijkstra and Philippa Eilhart, a powerful sorceress in Redania's service. They had learned that Vilgefortz and several other mages were secretly working with Nilfgaard, betraying the north to the southern empire. The plan was to expose these traitors during the conclave, to arrest them before they could do further damage. But the situation was far more complex than Dijkstra and Philippa realized. Vilgefortz was indeed a traitor, but his true loyalties lay only with himself. He had his own plans for Ciri, schemes that went beyond simple political allegiance. When violence broke out across the island, mages battling mages in spectacular and devastating magical combat, Vilgefortz revealed his true colors. Geralt found himself in the middle of the conflict, trying to protect Ciri while navigating a battle that was far beyond normal human comprehension. Mages hurled fireballs and lightning bolts. Portals opened and closed, teleporting combatants across the island. The very air crackled with magical energy, so intense it made the Witcher's medallion vibrate constantly against his chest. During the chaos, Geralt confronted Vilgefortz directly. The mage was not just powerful in magic, he was also an exceptional physical combatant, having trained in martial arts before ever learning sorcery. The fight between them was brutal. Vilgefortz moved with impossible speed, blocking Geralt's sword strikes with a simple staff, while simultaneously casting spells. The Witcher fought with every skill he possessed, but he was overmatched. Vilgefortz shattered Geralt's leg with a single strike, then proceeded to beat him nearly to death, breaking bones and causing internal injuries that would never fully heal. But Vilgefortz did not kill Geralt. Instead, he let him live, perhaps out of some twisted sense of honor, or perhaps simply because killing the Witcher served no immediate purpose. What Vilgefortz truly wanted was Ciri, and she had fled during the battle. Ciri had witnessed the fight, had seen Geralt beaten down by an opponent he could not defeat. Terror and rage flooded through her in equal measure. She ran, not knowing where to go, only understanding that she had to escape. The island was in chaos, mages fighting each other, buildings burning, the carefully ordered world of Thanedd dissolving into violent anarchy. She made her way to Torlara, the ancient tower that stood at the highest point of the island. The tower was forbidden to students, protected by powerful wards, and filled with dangerous artifacts. But in her panic and desperation, Ciri did not care about warnings or rules. She climbed the tower's spiral stairs, hearing pursuit behind her, knowing that if she was caught, terrible things awaited her. At the top of the tower, she found an ancient elven portal, dormant and unstable. This was Benevent's portal, built by the Aen Elle elves in a time long past. The mages of Eretuzza knew of its existence and had forbidden its use precisely because it was unpredictable and dangerous. But Ciri, driven by desperation and instinct rather than knowledge, reached out to the portal with her power. The elder blood within her responded to the ancient elven magic. The portal activated with a burst of light and energy so intense that it could be seen across the entire island. Lightning struck the tower, a massive discharge of magical power that marked the opening of a doorway between worlds, and Ciri, barely understanding what she was doing, threw herself through. The passage was violent and disorienting. The portal was unstable, its destination uncertain. Ciri felt herself torn through space, through the barriers between realities, spinning through a void that had no up or down, no beginning or end. Then, suddenly, she was ejected, thrown out of the portal in mid-air, above an endless expanse of sand and stone. She fell, hitting the ground hard enough to lose consciousness. When she finally came to, hours or perhaps days later, she had no idea where she was. The sun beat down on her with merciless intensity, turning the landscape into a shimmering hellscape. The air was so dry it hurt to breathe. There was no water, no shade, no sign of civilization in any direction. Ciri had landed in the Koreth Desert, known to those who lived on its edges as the Frying Pan. It lay far to the south and east of the northern kingdoms, between the Nilfgaardian Empire and distant Zerrikania. It was one of the most hostile environments in the known world, a place where even experienced travelers would perish without adequate preparation. And Ciri had arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small dagger at her belt. She tried to walk, but in the desert, direction meant nothing. The landscape looked the same in every direction, an endless sea of sand and rock under a burning yellow sky. She had no map, no compass, no way to orient herself. The sun moved across the heavens, providing some sense of time passing, but it offered no guidance on which way she should travel. Dehydration set in quickly. Her mouth became dry, her tongue swelling. Her skin burned under the relentless sun. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but thirst was the real killer. She stumbled through the sand, falling and rising, her mind beginning to fragment under the physical stress and the trauma of what she had witnessed on Thanedd. In her delirium, Ciri began to have visions. She saw Geralt, tortured and dying. She saw Yennefer, screaming in pain. The visions were so real, so vivid, that she could not distinguish them from reality. Were these things happening? Were they memories? Were they prophecies of things yet to come? She could not tell, and the uncertainty was its own form of torture. She collapsed in the sand, certain that she was going to die in this god-forsaken wasteland. No one knew where she was. No one could help her. She would simply cease to exist, her bones bleached by the sun, her story ending not with glory or purpose, but with meaningless suffering in an empty desert. But then, as consciousness faded, she saw something impossible. A young unicorn stood before her, white as fresh snow, with a horn that gleamed like polished silver. It regarded her with intelligent eyes, then gently nudged her with its muzzle. Ciri's delirium-addled mind could not process what she was seeing. Unicorns were supposed to be extinct, hunted to death centuries ago. Yet here one stood, real and solid. The unicorn's name was Ihwaraquax, though Ciri would come to call him Little Horse, a nickname that amused the ancient and powerful being. In truth, unicorns were not the simple animals of legend. They were highly intelligent, magical creatures with their own complex society and motivations. They possessed abilities similar to the Elder Blood, able to traverse between worlds and manipulate space and time to a degree that even the most powerful mages could not match. Ihwaraquax had sensed Ciri's arrival in the desert, drawn by the signature of her Elder Blood. He recognized in her something important, though whether he understood the full implications of her existence is unclear. What mattered was that he chose to help her, to guide her through the wasteland rather than let her die. Together, they were able to survive. Ihwaraquax knew where to find the rare sources of water in the desert, hidden springs and underground streams that only someone with his knowledge could locate. He could sense danger, warning Ciri away from the creatures that lurked beneath the sand. When a massive predator emerged, a desert drake with scales like stone and teeth like daggers, it was Ihwaraquax who helped her fight it off. But during that battle, the unicorn was wounded. The drake's bite contained venom, a toxin that began to spread through Ihwaraquax's system. Ciri watched in horror as her savior began to weaken, poisoned and dying. She had no knowledge of how to treat such a wound, no herbs or medicines that could help. In desperation, she remembered Yennefer's lessons about magic, about channeling power to achieve specific effects. Fire magic was one of the most dangerous forms of spellcasting. It was primal and destructive, difficult to control even for experienced mages. Yennefer had specifically warned Ciri against using it without proper training. But faced with Ihwaraquax's impending death, Ciri made a choice. She would try to burn away the poison with magical fire, cauterizing the wound and killing the venom before it could kill her friend. She reached deep within herself, finding the wellspring of power that was the Elder Blood. She shaped it as best she could, trying to control the flow of energy, to direct it with precision rather than letting it explode outward in raw chaos. Fire erupted from her hands, engulfing the unicorn's wound. Ihwaraquax screamed, a sound that tore at Ciri's heart, but she did not stop. She poured more power into the spell, burning and burning, until she was certain the poison was gone. The effort left her exhausted, barely conscious, but it had worked. The unicorn's breathing steadied, the wound closing with unnatural speed as his own magical healing took over. Ihwaraquax would survive, thanks to Ciri's desperate gambit, but the use of fire magic came with a price. During the spell casting, Ciri had experienced visions more intense than anything before. She saw a woman with wild eyes and burning hatred, speaking to her in a voice that seemed to come from inside her own head. The woman called herself Falka, and she claimed kinship with Ciri, a connection through blood and destiny. Falka had been a real historical figure, a princess who led a rebellion centuries ago. She was known for her cruelty and madness, for burning her enemies alive and committing atrocities that made her name synonymous with evil. But she was also a victim in her own way, betrayed by family and driven to extremes. And most importantly, she carried the Elder Blood in her veins, making her one of Ciri's ancestors. The encounter with Falka's spirit, or perhaps just a manifestation of Ciri's own fears and anger, was profoundly disturbing. It showed Ciri what she could become if she allowed rage and pain to consume her. She promised herself that she would never use fire magic again, that she would not walk the path that Falka had walked. But the seed had been planted, the knowledge of that dark potential now living within her consciousness. As Ciri and Ihuaraquax finally reached the edge of the desert, having survived against all odds, they were met not with salvation, but with a new threat. A group of men on horseback waited for them, bounty hunters employed by Nilfgaard to search for the Princess of Cintra. They had been tracking rumors and magical signatures, and now they had found their prize. Ciri was weak from her ordeal, in no condition to fight. The bounty hunters captured her easily, binding her hands and throwing her onto a horse. She had survived the desert, only to fall into the hands of those who would sell her to the highest bidder. Her journey through hell was not yet over. In fact, it was only beginning. The bounty hunters were professional and efficient, the kind of men who made their living tracking down fugitives and selling them to whoever paid best. They handled Ciri without particular cruelty, but also without compassion, viewing her as merchandise rather than a person. She was valuable, that much was clear, though most of them did not know exactly why. Orders had come from high places in Nilfgaard, offering a substantial reward for a girl matching Ciri's description. That was enough for them. They traveled for days, keeping Ciri bound and under constant watch. She was given barely enough food and water to survive, kept deliberately weakened so she would not attempt escape. The leader of the group, a man named Swears, took particular care to ensure she could not access her magical abilities, having been warned that she might be a source. They used certain herbs in her food that dulled magical sensitivity, making it nearly impossible for her to gather the concentration necessary for spellcasting. But fate, as always, had other plans. On their way to collect the bounty, the hunters encountered another group, a band of young outlaws who were causing trouble throughout the region. These were the Rats, 6 young people brought together by tragedy, rejection, and a shared hunger for violence and vengeance against a world that had wronged them. The leader was Gisela, a young man who had deserted from an army after watching comrades suffer terrible fates. He survived when his gang wandered into free elf territory and was nearly killed, pinned to a tree by an elven arrow before being rescued. His second-in-command of sorts was Kayleigh, a survivor of a ransacked village who had witnessed the death of his family at the hands of Nilfgaardian forces. Then there was Missel, who came from a wealthy noble family in the city of Thurn, in northern Maegd. When her father joined a rebellion and vanished, her family fled from approaching pacifiers. Missel, pampered since childhood and unable to keep pace with the fleeing refugees, was captured by manhunters. These men intended to sell young girls, and what followed was a horror that left deep scars. She was brutally assaulted by Nilfgaardian soldiers who had killed the manhunters, then left for dead in a ditch. Only Missel survived among the captured girls, found by Aen, another member of the Rats, and given a chance to become something other than a victim. Aen himself had witnessed terrible violence against his own family before finding Missel and choosing to help her rather than pursue revenge. Reef was a Nilfgaardian soldier who had been left behind by his comrades, now fighting alongside those whose families the Empire had destroyed. And finally, there was Iskra, an elf whose name meant Child of Fire. She had been banished from free elf territory for reasons that remained her own secret. She had a particular taste for violence, finding in bloodshed a kind of release that normal life could not provide. These 6 had banded together not out of friendship, but out of necessity and shared trauma. They robbed merchants and nobles, not to redistribute wealth like legendary outlaws, but because they enjoyed the thrill of violence and wanted luxuries they could not otherwise afford. They killed for entertainment, finding in murder a way to exert control over a world that had so thoroughly controlled them. They were not heroes. They were damaged young people who had learned all the wrong lessons from their suffering. When the rats encountered the bounty hunters, they saw an opportunity. The hunters were transporting a high-value prisoner, which likely meant they had coin. The rats attacked with the reckless confidence of youth, catching the hunters off guard. A chaotic melee erupted, steel ringing against steel, men screaming and dying. During the chaos, Ciri found herself bound near Kayleigh, who had been captured by a gang called the Nissa, working with the bounty hunters. Kayleigh begged for help. At first, Ciri hesitated, terrified and uncertain. But when she heard the Nissa gang members discussing their plans for her, plans that involved violence and violation, she made her choice. She used the knife from her meal to cut Kayleigh's bonds. When the rest of the rats arrived and attacked the inn where they were being held, Ciri fought alongside Kayleigh, her witcher training evident in every movement. The rats turned their attention to Ciri, this strange girl who had helped one of their own. They recognized her sword skills, the way she moved and fought despite her weakened state. Geralt's training had left its mark on her, visible to those who knew what to look for. They asked her name. Ciri, still traumatized from the desert and terrified of revealing her identity, spoke in elder speech, the ancient elven language. She said Givalchak, meaning falcon, but the rats, not fluent in the old tongue, heard it differently. They heard Falca, the name of the ancient rebel princess whose spirit Ciri had encountered in the desert. And so she became Falca to them, named after a woman known for destruction and madness. The rats gave Ciri a choice: join them or go her own way. She could have left. She could have tried to find her way back to Geralt and Yennefer, but the thought of facing the world alone, still hunted, still in danger, was too much. And more than that, she felt something with the rats that she had not felt since Cintra fell. A sense of belonging, however twisted. These were people who understood trauma, who had survived horrors and emerged hardened. They would not pity her or try to shelter her. They would simply accept her as one of their own. She joined them, and in doing so, began one of the darkest chapters of her life. Life with the rats was unlike anything Ciri had experienced. They lived like outcasts, moving from place to place, robbing merchants and nobles. Ciri participated in these robberies, her witcher training evident in every movement. She was good at it, her sword moving with precision, her footwork impeccable. But the rats did not simply rob. They killed, often unnecessarily. Ciri watched as they cut down merchants who had already surrendered, as they burned buildings and laughed at the screams. At first, she was horrified, but gradually, terribly, she became numb to it. Then she began to participate. The first time Ciri killed someone who did not need to die, she felt physically ill afterward. But the rats congratulated her, treated her as truly one of them now. There was something seductive in their acceptance, in being valued for her skills without questions about destiny or prophecy. With them, she was simply Falca, a member of the gang. Missel took a particular interest in Ciri, though the nature of that interest was complex and troubling. On their first night together, after a particularly brutal robbery, Missel came to Ciri's bed. What followed was neither entirely consensual nor entirely forced. existing in an ambiguous space that Ciri's traumatized mind struggled to process. Missel herself had survived brutal sexual violence, and the relationship that developed between her and Ciri was built more on shared trauma and desperate need for connection than genuine affection. It was not healthy, but in the darkness and isolation they both felt, it was what they had. The rats became notorious throughout the region. Local authorities put prices on their heads, but the group was too skilled and too unpredictable to be easily caught. They also had the support, or at least the silence, of many common people. The rats gave away some of their stolen goods to peasants, buying loyalty and information. When someone tried to betray them to authorities, the rats would burn their home with them inside it. Fear and gratitude combined to create a network of protection that made them difficult to track. But their notoriety also attracted dangerous attention. Among the nobles who knew of the rats was a baron named Cossidé. His daughter had been traumatized when the rats robbed her carriage, and Falca had taken the girl's brooch as a trophy. The baron wanted revenge, wanted the girl who had terrified his daughter brought before him so he could inflict upon her every punishment his imagination could devise. Baron Cossidé was not a man to handle things himself, however. He was wealthy and connected enough to hire the best. So he reached out to a man whose reputation was whispered in fear across the continent. He hired Leo Bonhart, a bounty hunter and killer who was legendary for his skill and his complete lack of mercy. Leo Bonhart was a figure from nightmares, a tall, ghoulishly thin man with a grey moustache and eyes like those of a dead fish. Cold, expressionless, utterly devoid of empathy. He had been a professional soldier before turning to bounty hunting, and his skills with a blade were said to rival those of witchers. Around his neck, he wore 3 medallions taken as trophies: a wolf, a cat, and a griffin. He claimed to have killed the witches who had once worn them. He was expensive to hire, but Baron Cossidé paid his price without hesitation. However, Bonhart had another employer as well. Stefan Skellen, the imperial coroner of Nilfgaard, had also commissioned him, though with different instructions. Skellen wanted Ciri captured alive, but when Bonhart informed the Baron of this additional contract, Cossidé offered even more money with a simple addendum: "Kill the girl, if you cannot bring her to me alive." Meanwhile, the rats had received a tip from their informant network. A man named Hotspurn, who sometimes fed them information about potential targets, warned them that Bonhart was hunting them. The warning came with details. Bonhart was currently in a small village called Jealousy, likely waiting for them to make a move. Hotspurn also brought news of a general amnesty being offered by Emperor Emhyr. Anyone who turned themselves in and confessed their crimes would be drafted into the army rather than executed, a chance to serve the Empire and have their past forgiven. The rats discussed this option, but ultimately rejected it. They had no desire to serve in anyone's army, to trade one form of control for another. And besides, they were young and arrogant, confident in their abilities. They had taken down merchants, minor nobles, and local militia groups. How dangerous could one man be, even if he was legendary? Ciri, however, had heard different news that consumed her attention entirely. A false Ciri had been presented in Nilfgaard, a girl who claimed to be the Princess of Cintra. Emperor Emhyr planned to marry this impostor, using her to legitimize his claim to the Cintran throne. Learning of this sparked something in Ciri, a fury and indignation that cut through the numbness she had cultivated. That throne was her birthright. She was the true Princess of Cintra, and some false pretender was stealing her identity, her heritage, everything she had lost. She decided to leave the rats, to travel to Nilfgaard and expose the fraud. She tried to leave quietly, before dawn, not wanting emotional goodbyes or arguments. But her plans changed when she learned that the rats had decided to confront Bonhart directly, rather than flee or hide. They were riding to jealousy to kill him before he could kill them. Ciri tried to dissuade them, but they would not listen. They were confident, almost cheerful about the prospect of facing down the legendary bounty hunter. In their minds, defeating Bonhart would cement their reputation across the continent. They would become legends themselves, the gang that killed the unkillable man. So Ciri rode after them, hoping to help, fearing the worst. By the time she reached jealousy, it was already over. The scene was a massacre. Bodies lay scattered in the dirt. The rats who had been her companions for months now reduced to corpses. Their heads had been cut off, preserved for the bounties that Bonhart would collect on them. Only Missel still breathed, but barely, bleeding out from terrible wounds. Bonhart stood in the middle of the carnage, calmly cleaning his sword. When he saw Ciri approach, he smiled, the expression containing no warmth whatsoever. He had been waiting for her. He could have killed Missel already, but he had kept her alive specifically, so Ciri would arrive in time to watch her die. He made Missel's death slow and agonizing, sawing off her head with deliberate cruelty, while Ciri screamed and raged, but could do nothing. She tried to attack him, but he disarmed her with contemptuous ease. He was faster than she was, stronger, more experienced. Every trick Geralt had taught her, every skill she had honed, meant nothing against Bonhart's overwhelming superiority. When Missel finally died, Bonhart turned his attention to Ciri. He did not kill her, did not even seriously injure her. Instead, he beat her until she could barely stand, then chained her and threw her onto a horse. His contracts called for her capture, and regardless of which employer he ultimately delivered her to, she was worth more alive than dead. What followed was a period of captivity that Ciri would never fully recover from. Bonhart kept her imprisoned, moving from place to place to avoid anyone who might rescue her. He beat her regularly, not out of anger but with cold calculation, breaking her will through systematic brutality. He fed her Fistek, a highly addictive drug that clouded thought and dulled magical ability. Under its influence, Ciri could barely think straight, let alone attempt to use her powers or plan an escape. But Bonhart's cruelty had a purpose beyond simple sadism. He wanted to learn about her, to confirm her identity and understand her value. Through careful questioning and observation, he determined that she was exactly who Skellen believed her to be, Cirilla of Cintra, the girl with elder blood, worth a fortune to the right buyer. He also discovered her witcher training. Watching her move, even weakened by drugs and beatings, he recognized the style. She fought like a witcher, though she lacked their mutations and enhancements. This gave Bonhart an idea, one that would prove profitable and entertaining in equal measure. He had a cousin named Húfan who operated a gladiatorial arena in the town of Claremont. It was illegal, of course, operating in the grey spaces of law enforcement, catering to nobles and wealthy merchants who enjoyed watching people fight and die for their entertainment. Bonhart approached his cousin with a proposition. He had a girl trained as a witcher who could put on quite a show. In return for a share of the profits, he would let Húfan use her as a fighter in the arena. Húfan agreed immediately. A girl who fought like a witcher would be a unique attraction, drawing crowds and gambling money from across the region. Before putting her in the arena, however, Bonhart needed to give her a proper weapon. He purchased a sword from a smith in the town of Fano, a magnificent blade called Ciri Elle, meaning swallow in Elder speech. It was a gwaihir, a blade forged by gnomes using techniques known only to them, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Bonhart gave it to Ciri not as a gift, but as a necessity. She would need a proper sword if she was going to survive in the arena, and her survival was essential to his continued profit. The fights in Claremont's arena were brutal affairs. Ciri was forced to battle criminals, monsters, and occasionally other unwilling participants. The crowd roared with bloodlust, betting on how long she would last, whether she would kill or be killed. Bonhart watched from his private box, calculating profits and planning future matches. But something unexpected happened as the fights continued. Ciri, drugged and beaten, traumatized beyond measure, found something within herself during those battles. When she fought, when her life was on the line, the training from Kaer Morhen reasserted itself. Her movements became fluid and precise. She dodged with Witcher reflexes, struck with Witcher accuracy. She survived fight after fight, match after match, and the crowds loved her. The spectators called her the Swallow, inspired by her sword's name and the grace with which she moved. They did not know who she really was, and they did not care. To them, she was simply entertainment, a curiosity to watch and wager on. But to Bonhart, watching from above, she was confirmation of everything he had suspected. This girl, broken as she was, contained within her the training and spirit of a true warrior. She was indeed something special. During this period, Bonhart took her to meetings with his employers. He traveled to the village of Unicorn, where he had arranged to meet with Stefan Skellen, and also with Rience, a mage who had been hunting Ciri for his own mysterious master. The meeting was meant to determine what to do with Ciri, which client would ultimately receive her. But a spy named Nerotinsika, who was secretly working against Skellen's faction, saw an opportunity. He helped Ciri escape while Bonhart and the others were distracted with their negotiations. Ciri fled on her horse, Kelpie, a magnificent steed that had accompanied her through many trials. But Skellen saw her escaping and struck her with an Orion, a weapon that severely wounded her. She barely managed to stay in the saddle as Kelpie carried her away from her pursuers. They rode hard, blood trailing behind them from Ciri's wound. Bonhart killed Nerotinsika for his betrayal, then set out in pursuit. But Ciri had a head start, and Kelpie was a remarkable horse. They made it to the Paraplutte Swamp, a dangerous and isolated wetland where few dared to travel. There, barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion, Ciri was found by an elderly man named Visogota of Corvo. He was a philosopher and hermit who had retreated to the swamp to escape the politics and violence of the wider world. He had his own tragic past, having lost his family during the wars, and he lived alone in a humble dwelling, surrounded by books and memories. Visogota took Ciri in without question, recognizing that she was gravely wounded and in desperate need of help. He cleaned and dressed her wounds, gave her a place to sleep, and asked no questions about who she was or where she had come from. In his isolated refuge, Ciri finally found a moment of peace, a temporary respite from the nightmare her life had become. As she recovered under Visogota's care, Ciri told him her story, not all at once, but gradually in pieces. She spoke of Cintra's fall, of Kaer Morhen and the witches. She talked about Yennefer and Geralt, about the desert and the rats. She spoke of Bonhart and the arena, of Missel's death. Visogota listened without judgment, offering comfort and wisdom when appropriate, but never forcing advice. During her time in the swamp, Ciri began to heal, though not just physically. The fog of Fistek gradually cleared from her mind. She could think clearly again, could feel emotions beyond fear and rage. She mourned properly for Missel and the rats. She grieved for the innocent girl she had once been. But Ciri knew she could not stay forever. Bonhart was still hunting her. Skellen still wanted her. Emperor Emhyr was desperate to find her. And somewhere out there, Geralt and Yennefer were searching. Moreover, Ciri had learned something terrible during her captivity. A portal had opened near the swamp, and through it she glimpsed another world, cold and dying, consumed by ice. The white frost represented the end of all things, and according to prophecy, only someone with elder blood could stop it. Destiny, it seemed, would not let her hide. The world needed her, whether she wanted to be needed or not. So Ciri prepared to leave Visigota's sanctuary, knowing that ahead of her lay trials that would dwarf even what she had already endured. The Tower of the Swallow appeared out of the fog like a dream made solid, ancient, and impossible. It stood where nothing should stand, existing in multiple realities simultaneously. Its proper name was Tor Ziriel, a twin to Tor Lara on Thanedd, both housing portals that could connect worlds. When Ciri fled from Skellen and Bonhart across the frozen lake, desperate and injured, the tower manifested in response to her power. The Elder Blood resonated with the ancient elven magic. Without fully understanding, Ciri ran into the tower and through the portal it contained. The transition was smoother than her chaotic escape from Thanedd, but no less disorienting. Reality folded around her. Colors that had no names flickered at the edges of vision. Then she was somewhere else entirely. The world of the Aen Elle elves was beautiful beyond comparison. The capital city, Tirnalia, was a marvel of architecture and magic intertwined. Buildings spiraled impossibly high. Gardens bloomed with flowers that changed colors. The very air seemed charged with power. The Aen Elle themselves were taller than humans, more graceful, with features almost painfully perfect. They were the Alder folk, elves who had left the continent 15 centuries ago after the conjunction of the spheres brought humans to what had been an elven world. These elves possessed the ability to travel between realities, using it to escape to a world they could make their own. In this new world, they found humans and unicorns. They slaughtered the humans without mercy, viewing them as primitive and inferior. The unicorns proved more difficult. These were not ordinary animals, but highly intelligent beings with their own magical abilities, capable of traveling between worlds, just as the elves once could. A war began that had continued for centuries, neither side gaining permanent advantage. Ciri's arrival was not unnoticed. An Aen Elle named Avallac'h greeted her, introducing himself as an Aen Savern, one of the Knowing Ones, the elven sages who studied and manipulated magical genetics. He was also, though Ciri did not initially know this, the one who had been betrothed to Lara Dorren before she chose the human mage, Cregennan. Avallac'h had spent centuries perfecting the Elder Blood genetic line, intending to create a child who could restore to the Aen Elle what they had lost when Lara chose love over duty. Avallac'h explained to Ciri that she had a debt to pay. Lara Dorren had stolen the Elder Blood from the elves by marrying a human. Now Ciri, Lara's descendant, must make amends. The debt could be settled simply. She needed to bear a child with King Oberon Mercatak, the ruler of the Aen Elle. Once she had conceived and carried the child to term, she would be free to return to her own world. Ciri was horrified by this proposition, but she also recognized that she had little choice. She was in a foreign world, surrounded by beings far more powerful than herself, with no clear way home. A magical barrier surrounded the lands of the Aen Elle, preventing her from simply using her powers to escape. If she wanted to return to her reality, to find Geralt and Yennefer, she would have to agree to Avallac'h's terms. On the journey to Tirnalea, Ciri met Eredin Breac-Glas, commander of the Diagruadri, the Red Riders who served as the Aen Elle's elite cavalry. In Ciri's world, they were known as the Wild Hunt, spectral riders who appeared in the night sky and brought death to those they encountered. Eredin was imposing and charismatic, with long black hair and armor that gleamed like starlight. He treated Ciri with a mixture of respect and calculated charm, clearly attempting to manipulate her emotions. Ciri found herself drawn to Eredin initially, responding to his attention in ways she later recognized as foolish. But she was young, traumatized, and desperately lonely. The Aen Elle were cold and aloof, viewing her as little more than a breeding tool. Eredin at least pretended to see her as a person, and that pretense was seductive, even when she suspected its falsity. During the journey, they encountered a pack of unicorns. These magnificent beings regarded Ciri with what seemed like recognition and concern. Later, she would learn that the unicorns were at war with the Aen Elle specifically because of the elves' attempts to control and weaponize the Elder Blood. The unicorns understood the danger such power represented, the potential for catastrophic misuse. They also recognized Ciri as someone who might choose a different path, who might resist becoming what others wanted her to be. Finally, they arrived at Tirnalea, and Ciri was brought before King Oberon Murkertach. He was ancient beyond human comprehension, having lived for over 650 years. He sat upon his throne with an air of weary authority, a monarch who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing in longer than most humans' family lines existed. Oberon looked at Ciri with eyes that held neither warmth nor cruelty, only a kind of resigned duty. He explained his perspective on the matter at hand. Lara Dorren had been his daughter, and she had betrayed the careful planning of generations by choosing a human lover. The power that should have remained with the Aen Elle had been diluted and scattered through human bloodlines. Now, finally, that power had returned in the form of Ciri, and it was only right that it be returned to its proper owners. Ciri argued that she owed them nothing, that she had not asked to be born with this blood, that Lara Dorren had the right to choose her own love. But her arguments fell on deaf ears. To the Aen Elle, individual choice mattered far less than the greater good of their people, and they saw Ciri's reluctance as childish selfishness. The attempts to conceive began, and they were uniformly disastrous. Oberon could not perform with Ciri. Whether it was because she was human and thus repulsive to him, or because he was simply too old and worn down by centuries of existence, the result was the same. Night after night, they tried and failed. Oberon's pride prevented him from admitting his inability, but the strain showed in his increasingly drawn features. Eredin observed these failures with interest. He came to Ciri privately and told her the truth that Avallac'h had concealed. They would never let her go, regardless of whether she bore Oberon's child. The Aen Elle needed her bloodline too desperately to risk losing it again. Once she had produced one child, they would demand another and another, until she had spent her life as nothing more than breeding stock. This revelation confirmed Ciri's darkest suspicions. She began to understand that she needed to escape, but the magical barrier that surrounded the Aen Elle lands prevented her from using her powers to simply teleport away. She needed help, and she found it in an unexpected place. The unicorns had been watching Ciri since her arrival. They could sense the goodness in her, the potential for her to resist the corruption that the Aen Elle represented. Among them was Ihwaraquax, now fully grown and far more powerful than when he had saved her in the desert. He communicated with Ciri through dreams and visions, showing her the truth of what the Aen Elle had planned, warning her of the danger she represented if she fell completely under their control. The unicorns explained that both Avallac'h and Eredin had once possessed the ability to open the Ardgath, the gates of the worlds, allowing free travel between realities. But they had lost this power over time, as the elder blood that granted it became diluted through successive generations. Now they sought to regain it through Ciri, but if they succeeded, they would use that power to conquer and enslave across multiple realities. The Aen Elle were not benevolent beings. They were supremacists who viewed all other races as inferior, fit only for subjugation or extermination. Eredin, meanwhile, took steps to ensure that Oberon would finally be able to perform with Ciri. He provided the king with what he claimed was an aphrodisiac, a potion that would restore his vigor and allow him to conceive the child they all desired. Oberon, desperate and humiliated by his failures, drank the potion without question. But the potion was poisoned. Whether Eredin intended to kill Oberon or simply miscalculated the dosage remains a matter of debate, but the result was unambiguous. The ancient king died that night, convulsing in agony as the toxin ravaged his body. Ciri was with him as he died, unable to help, watching as 6 centuries of life came to an end on a bed soaked with sweat and blood. With Oberon's death, Eredin declared himself the new king of the Aen Elle. He had long been the de facto ruler, commanding the military, while Oberon withdrew further into isolation. Now he simply made official what had been true in practice for years. But Oberon's death also created an opportunity for Ciri. The unicorns approached her openly, no longer hiding their interest. They explained how she could bypass the magical barrier that kept her trapped. She needed to reach the coast, to find a boat, and to sail through a specific location where the barrier's power weakened. They could not open a portal for her directly within the Aen Elle lands, but if she could get beyond the barrier, they could help her jump worlds and return to her own reality. Ciri stole a boat under cover of night, with Kelpie, her loyal horse, accompanying her. She sailed toward freedom, toward escape from a world that wanted to use her as a tool. But Eredin discovered her escape and pursued with his Red Riders. The wild hunt came for her across water and through dimensions, determined not to let their prize escape. A battle erupted on the waters, magical and physical combat intertwined. The unicorns came to Ciri's aid, fighting the wild hunt with their own considerable powers. Ihwaraquax himself stood between Ciri and her pursuers, buying her precious moments to escape. He told her to jump, to use her power and trust that he would guide her. So Ciri jumped, throwing herself into the space between worlds, letting the elder blood within her reach out for a path home. Ihwaraquax channeled his power through her, helping to direct her trajectory. But the wild hunt followed, pursuing her across realities, determined not to lose her now that they had come so close to possessing what they desired. What followed was a chase through space and time itself, Ciri jumping from world to world with Eredin and his riders, always close behind. She saw realities that defied description, civilizations that had evolved along paths utterly different from anything she knew. She passed through time's future and past, glimpsing the continent of her birth at different points in history. Each jump exhausted her, draining her power, and leaving her more vulnerable to capture. Finally, desperately, she jumped without aiming, simply trying to put distance between herself and her pursuers. She emerged in a world that seemed somehow familiar, yet completely alien. It took her several moments to realize where she was. Earth. But many centuries in the past or future, she could not tell which. The landscape was different, the stars in unfamiliar configurations. In this strange world, wandering lost and confused, Ciri encountered two women who would prove crucial to her survival. They were Nimue and Conduiramers, sorceresses from a time far in the future of her own world. They were studying the legend of Geralt and Ciri through magic and scholarship, piecing together the truth from fragments and myths. When Ciri appeared before them, they recognized her immediately, though to them she was a figure from ancient history. Nimue and Conduiramers, understanding the importance of this moment, used their power to create a portal specifically keyed to Ciri's home reality and time. They sent her back to where she belonged, back to finish the story that they knew from their history books, but that, for Ciri, was still being written. When Ciri returned to her own world, she had a singular purpose: rescue Yennefer. Through her travels and visions, she had learned that Yennefer was being held by Vilgefortz in his secret fortress, Stygia Castle. The powerful mage who had nearly killed Geralt at Thanedd now held the sorceress prisoner, using her as bait. Stygia Castle was located in a desolate region of Ebbing, built into a rocky cliff overlooking what had once been a lakebed. The castle itself was an architectural nightmare, with levels descending deep into stone and towers rising impossibly high. Dark magic permeated every stone, suppressing other powers and giving Vilgefortz near absolute control. The approach was littered with shipwrecks, vessels pulled through space by Vilgefortz's magic maelstrom in the Sedna Abyss, deposited as grim decorations. Ciri arrived alone, determined to trade herself for Yennefer's freedom. She fought through the outer defenses, her Witcher training allowing her to overcome guards unprepared for someone with her combination of skills. When she confronted Vilgefortz, the mage was unsurprised. He had been expecting her, planning for this moment. He told her calmly that unlike others who wanted to breed with her, he had a different approach. He wanted the Elder Blood for himself, and he did not need her alive. He planned to vivisect her, to extract her uterus and placenta while she still lived, using dark magic to harvest the genetic potential directly. Before Vilgefortz could begin his work, an unexpected arrival changed everything. Geralt and his companions had discovered Stygia Castle's location and arrived to mount their own rescue. With him came an unlikely band of allies. There was Dandelion, Geralt's oldest friend, the bard whose songs had made the Witcher famous. There was Milva, an archer of extraordinary skill. Regis, a higher vampire with centuries of experience and formidable powers. Cahir, the black-winged knight from Ciri's nightmares, who had revealed his true nature. He loved Ciri and sought to protect her from his own emperor. And finally, Angoulême, a young woman from Cintran nobility, who had been abandoned and forced into outlawry, who saw in Geralt's quest a chance for redemption. This company, which would come to be known in legend as Geralt's Hansa, assaulted Stygia Castle with singular determination. Regis used his vampire abilities to infiltrate the castle, killing guards with silent efficiency. The others fought their way through defenders who were well-trained, but ultimately outmatched by the desperation and skill of their attackers. The battle that erupted within Stygia Castle was chaotic and brutal. Various factions converged on the fortress simultaneously, each with their own agenda. Vilgefortz's mercenaries fought to protect their master. Stefan Skellen and his men arrived, still pursuing their own mission to capture Ciri. Leo Bonhart was there as well, having tracked Ciri across half the continent and determined to finally collect his bounty. In the twisting corridors and vast halls of the castle, individual battles played out with deadly consequence. Milva, the skilled archer who had fought alongside Geralt through so many trials, was struck by an arrow and mortally wounded. She died knowing she had helped save Ciri, finding peace in that sacrifice, even as her life bled away onto cold stone. Angoulême, the young outlaw who had found purpose in Geralt's quest, threw herself into battle with reckless courage. She protected Ciri from attackers, buying time with her own life. When she fell, she died with a smile, having finally done something worthy and good in a life marked by so much hardship. Cahir confronted Leo Bonhart in single combat, determined to buy time for Ciri to escape. The black-winged knight fought with skill and desperation, but Bonhart was simply better. The bounty hunter cut Cahir down with cold precision, ending the life of a man who had traveled from villain to hero in Ciri's story. Ciri herself faced Bonhart in the aftermath of Cahir's death. The man who had tormented her, beaten her, forced her to fight in gladiatorial matches, now stood before her with his sword drawn. He expected her to flee or beg for mercy, remembering the broken girl he had captured months ago. But Ciri was not that girl anymore. The trials she had endured, the worlds she had traversed, the revelations about her own nature and power, all of it had forged her into something far more dangerous than Bonhart anticipated. Their duel was fierce. Bonhart had decades of experience and a killer's instinct honed through countless battles. But Ciri had youth, training from the best witches in the world, and a burning need for justice. She matched him blow for blow, her sword Ciri singing through the air. Bonhart, surprised and impressed despite himself, fought with genuine effort, no longer viewing her as merely a prize to be collected. Ciri wounded him severely, bringing the legendary bounty hunter to his knees. He looked up at her, perhaps expecting the killing blow, perhaps calculating whether he could use her mercy against her. But Ciri denied him a quick death. She took the 3 Witcher medallions from around his neck, the trophies he had worn with pride, reclaiming them for the witches he claimed to have killed. Then she turned away, leaving him alive, but defeated. Bonhart, enraged by this humiliation, tried to attack Ciri from behind, but she heard him coming, her witcher senses alert to the danger. She spun and struck in one fluid motion, slashing his throat with Ciri. She watched him die without satisfaction, only grim recognition that this was necessary, that monsters like Bonhart would not stop, unless stopped permanently. Meanwhile, Geralt and Yennefer had found Vilgefortz. The sorceress had been freed from her bindings by Geralt's arrival, and together they faced the mage who had orchestrated so much suffering. The battle was apocalyptic in its intensity. Vilgefortz hurled magical attacks that would have reduced normal humans to ash. Geralt dodged and weaved, using every ounce of his witcher reflexes to stay alive. Yennefer countered Vilgefortz's spells with her own, creating a magical duel that made reality itself seem fragile. Regis arrived to aid them, using his vampire powers to distract Vilgefortz. But the mage, recognizing the threat, literally tore Regis apart with his bare hands, demonstrating strength far beyond what any human should possess. He then used magic to melt what remained of Regis, nearly killing the vampire permanently. The battle continued with Geralt and Yennefer fighting together, their movements synchronized from years of knowing each other, fighting beside and against each other in turns. But Vilgefortz was winning, his power simply too great. He prepared to deliver a killing blow to Yennefer, and Geralt could see no way to stop it. Then he remembered the amulet that Fringilla Vigo had given him, a magical talisman with powers he did not fully understand. In desperation, he activated it, and the amulet released stored magical energy directly at Vilgefortz. The mage was caught off guard, his defenses penetrated by the unexpected attack. In that moment of vulnerability, Geralt struck, driving his sword through Vilgefortz's body. The mage fell, dying but still conscious. He looked up at Geralt with something like respect, acknowledging that the Witcher had proven himself worthy. Then Vilgefortz died, his schemes and ambitions ending on the blood-stained floor of his own fortress. As the surviving members of Geralt's company tried to regroup, preparing to escape with Ciri, a new complication arose. A Nilfgaardian force arrived, led by Emperor Emhyr var Emreis himself. He had come with his personal Impera brigade, determined to finally reclaim his daughter, regardless of the cost. Stefan Skellen and his remaining mercenaries realized they were hopelessly outnumbered and surrendered without a fight. Emhyr arrested Skellen for treason, for the spymaster had been secretly working with nobles who sought to overthrow the emperor. The emperor's plans for Ciri, however, remained unclear. Emhyr took Geralt aside for a private conversation, and the Witcher finally understood the full truth he had suspected for some time. Emhyr confirmed it directly. He was Duni, the man who had married Pavetta under a curse, Ciri's biological father. The supposed death at sea years ago had been staged. Emhyr explained that he had worked with Vilgefortz to fake their deaths so they could escape to Nilfgaard. However, Pavetta had discovered his plans and smuggled Ciri back to Cintra before boarding the ship. When Emhyr realized Ciri was not with them, a violent confrontation erupted. In his telling to Geralt, Pavetta fell overboard during the struggle. The Witcher's response, wondering aloud how a man feels after murdering his wife, made clear what he believed had truly happened. Whether Emhyr pushed her, or whether she fell remains ambiguous, but either way, he had allowed her to drown rather than save her, choosing his ambitions over her life. Now Emhyr explained his plans. According to Ithlinne's prophecy, a child born of the Elder Blood would either save or destroy the world. Emhyr intended to ensure this child would exist, and would be raised to rule the largest empire the continent had ever known. To achieve this, he would marry Ciri and father a child with her, despite the fact that she was his daughter. Geralt was horrified, understanding the full implications. Emhyr planned to commit incest, to treat his own daughter as a breeding tool for political power. The Emperor explained coldly that Geralt and Yennefer knew too much, understood the truth of his identity. He could not allow them to live with such knowledge. He gave them a choice. They could fight and be killed, or they could commit suicide together, dying with dignity rather than at the hands of executioners. Geralt and Yennefer, exhausted from battle and recognizing they could not defeat an entire brigade of elite soldiers, began to prepare for death. They held each other, speaking quietly of regrets and love, preparing to end their lives rather than see Ciri subjected to Emhyr's plans. But Ciri interrupted them. She had overheard everything, understood what her father intended. She confronted Emhyr, not with rage, but with tears, speaking to him as a daughter rather than as a political asset. She told him that Geralt and Yennefer were her real parents, the ones who had loved her and sacrificed for her. They were her family in all the ways that mattered. Something in Emhyr broke in that moment. He was not a good man, had never pretended to be, but he was not completely devoid of humanity. Seeing Ciri's tears, understanding that proceeding with his plan would destroy her utterly, he made a different choice. He told her to go, to take Geralt and Yennefer and leave. He would find another way to fulfill the prophecy, another path to secure his empire's future. Ciri, Geralt, and Yennefer left Stigger Castle together, finally reunited after so long apart. They travelled through Ebbing, Ciri taking time to exact revenge on those who had wronged her during her captivity. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled Cintra. She was a young woman who had walked through hell and emerged with a clear understanding of her own power and agency. They eventually made their way to Monte Calvo, where the Lodge of Sorceresses had convened. The Lodge was a secret organization of powerful women who sought to control the political destiny of the continent from behind the scenes. They had their own plans for Ciri, viewing her as a political tool to be married to a prince of their choosing, used to produce heirs who would be raised by the Lodge itself. Yennefer went ahead to meet with the Lodge, while Ciri and Geralt travelled to Toussaint, a beautiful duchy known for its wines, art, and relative peace. There they found Dandelion, about to be executed by Duchess Anna Henrietta for various romantic complications. They rescued the bard, and then Ciri departed to face the Lodge, while Geralt and Dandelion continued on to Rivia. At Monte Calvo, Ciri faced the assembled sorceresses who thought they could control her destiny. Philippa Eilhart, Fringilla Vigo, Triss Merigold, and others laid out their plans. They informed her that since Emhyr had married a false Ciri, she could not claim the Cintran throne. Instead, she would become the mistress of Prince Tancred of Kovir, bearing him children with the Elder Blood that the Lodge would raise and control. Ciri listened to their plans with growing anger. These powerful women, who spoke of protecting the world and creating stability, saw her as nothing more than a womb to be used for their political schemes. They were no better than Emhyr, no better than Vilgefortz or the Aen Elle. They all wanted to use her, to control her, to reduce her to a function rather than acknowledging her as a person. But Ciri made a different choice. She asked permission to leave temporarily, to honor a promise she had made to meet Geralt in Rivia, with the understanding that she would return to Monte Calvo afterward. Philippa Eilhart, surprisingly, cast the deciding vote in favor of allowing this. Perhaps she recognized that forcing Ciri would only breed resentment. Perhaps she truly believed in destiny finding its own path. Regardless, Ciri was allowed to leave. In Rivia, a bustling trade city on the river Pontar, Geralt was spending time with old friends. Yarpin Sigrin and Zoltan Chive, dwarven companions from various adventures, had gathered to reminisce about old times. The city was tense, with racial animosity between humans and non-humans reaching a breaking point. Scoia'tael attacks on human settlements and brutal reprisals had created a cycle of violence and hatred. A pogrom erupted without warning. An angry mob of humans, whipped into a frenzy by demagogues and fear, began attacking non-humans in the streets. They pulled elves and dwarves from their homes, beating them and worse. Geralt saw his friends in danger and made a choice that defined his character. He intervened. The White Wolf fought to protect innocent people from mob violence, using his swords not against monsters, but against humans consumed by hate. He saved lives that day, pulling people to safety and holding back the worst of the violence. but in the chaos, someone stabbed him from behind with a pitchfork, the crude weapon driven deep into his body. Geralt fell, dying not in glorious combat against some legendary monster, but in a dirty street riot, killed by a frightened peasant who probably did not even know who he had struck. It was an ignoble end for a legendary witcher, but perhaps a fitting one. Geralt had spent his life trying to remain neutral, trying to avoid the politics and passions of humans. In the end, his decision to intervene, to choose sides, cost him his life. Yennefer and Ciri arrived to find Geralt bleeding out on the cobblestones. Triss Merigold was also there, and together the sorceresses conjured a storm to disperse the rioters. But the damage was done. Geralt was dying, his injuries too severe for ordinary healing. Yennefer gave everything she had to save him, pouring her magical energy into keeping him alive, trying to mend wounds that should have been immediately fatal. She drained herself completely, collapsing unconscious from the effort. But still Geralt teetered on the edge of death. Then Ihwaraquax appeared, the unicorn who had saved Ciri in the desert and helped her escape the Aen Elle. He channeled his power through Ciri, combining it with what remained of Yennefer's magic. The three of them together, in that moment, created something miraculous. Geralt's wounds closed, his breathing steadied. He lived, pulled back from death's door by the combined efforts of those who loved him most. Ciri found a boat and placed Geralt and Yennefer inside it, both of them unconscious but alive. Ihwaraquax indicated a direction, and together they sailed into mist that seemed to come from nowhere. What happened next depends on who tells the story and what they choose to believe. Some say that Geralt and Yennefer died despite Ciri's efforts, that the boat carried them to some afterlife or other plane of existence. Others claim that Ciri used her powers to take them to another world entirely, one where they could live in peace away from the endless conflicts of their home. The truth remains ambiguous, deliberately so, because some stories do not need definitive endings. What happened after leaving Rivia depends on which path one follows through Ciri's story. The books provide one account, while the video games by CD Projekt Red present an alternate timeline that diverges from the novels after the events at Rivia. Both are valid interpretations of Ciri's journey, each offering different insights into her character and destiny. In the books, after leaving Rivia, Ciri traveled to another world or time, where she met a knight of King Arthur's court named Sir Galahad. She told him her story, all of it, warning him that it did not have a happy ending. Then she continued on her journey. The books leave her ultimate fate deliberately ambiguous, allowing readers to imagine what became of the woman who carried the weight of prophecy and power. The video game series, however, offers a different continuation. In this timeline, years passed between the events at Rivia and Ciri's next appearance. These games are set in an alternate universe from the books, where certain events unfolded differently after Geralt and Yennefer's disappearance. While based on the novels, the games create their own canon that allows for new adventures and different outcomes. In The Witcher 3, Ciri had been hiding in various worlds for more than half a year, pursued relentlessly by the Wild Hunt. She discovered that Geralt had been captured by Eredin's forces, and she managed to free him, sending him back to the forests near Kaer Morhen. However, the ordeal cost Geralt his memories, setting the stage for the events of the first game in the series. The Wild Hunt continued pursuing Ciri because of the White Frost. The apocalypse was accelerating, threatening the Aen Elle's world with extinction. Eredin, now king of the Aen Elle, sought to use Ciri's powers to evacuate his people to another world, specifically the continent where Ciri had been raised. He would conquer it, establish the Aen Elle as rulers, and let his own dying world freeze in isolation. Years later, when Geralt had recovered his memories and reunited with old companions, the Wild Hunt made their move. They attacked Kaer Morhen directly, a massive assault designed to capture Ciri once and for all. The battle was desperate, with witches, sorceresses, and various allies fighting against the spectral riders and the ice they brought with them. During the battle, Vesemir, the old witcher who had trained Ciri so many years ago, was captured by Imlerith, one of Eredin's generals. When Vesemir made a final desperate attack to save Ciri, Imlerith killed him. Ciri's grief and rage exploded outward. In a massive magical detonation, a scream of pure Elder Blood power that killed many of the Wild Hunt's soldiers and forced Eredin to retreat. Vesemir's funeral was held at Kaer Morhen, and Ciri blamed herself for his death. But Geralt and the others helped her understand that Vesemir had died as he lived, protecting those he loved, and that his death meant something because she lived. The hunt for the Wild Hunt continued, with Geralt, Ciri, and their allies tracking Eredin and his remaining forces across the continent. They fought the Hunt's generals one by one. Ciri personally killed Caranthir after he wounded her in battle. Geralt defeated Imlerith, avenging Vesemir. Finally, they faced Eredin himself. The final confrontation took place on Undvik, one of the Skellig Islands. Avallac'h, who had been helping Ciri all along despite his ambiguous loyalties, used a magical artifact called the Sunstone to draw the Wild Hunt's fleet out of hiding. A massive naval battle erupted, with Nilfgaardian and Skellig ships fighting against the spectral vessels of the Hunt. Geralt fought Eredin in single combat, while reality itself seemed to fray around them. The king of the Wild Hunt was a formidable opponent, but Geralt had survived too much and fought too hard to lose now. He killed Eredin, and with his dying breath, the fallen king warned Geralt not to trust Avallac'h, claiming that the elf had manipulated them all. But there was no time to investigate these claims, because the conjunction of the spheres was beginning anew, and the white frost was manifesting. Reality itself was tearing open, allowing the apocalyptic cold to begin seeping into the world. Only Ciri, with her elder blood and her mastery of space and time, could stop it. In the game's interpretation, the white frost was not something that could be destroyed through force. It was presented as a natural astronomical phenomenon, the inevitable result of orbital and axial shifts that would eventually freeze the Northern Hemisphere thousands of years in the future. According to this version, the true purpose of the Elder Blood was not to prevent the apocalypse, but to open the gates between worlds so that populations could evacuate before the freeze consumed everything. She prepared to sacrifice herself, to enter the rift and face the white frost directly. Geralt pleaded with her not to go, but Ciri was resolute. This was her story, she told him, and she would see it through to the end. The choices Geralt had made throughout his time with Ciri determined what happened next. If Geralt showed faith in Ciri's abilities throughout their journey together, trusted her judgment, and encouraged her confidence through key moments in the story, then Ciri entered the rift with strength and determination. In this outcome, she faced the core of the White Frost not to destroy it, but to redirect its power, using her mastery of space to send it somewhere it could do no harm. She survived the ordeal and returned to the world, having saved reality itself from extinction in her own way. What came after depended on choices made throughout the journey. In one possible outcome, she became Empress of Nilfgaard, taking up the throne her biological father had prepared for her, using her power and position to bring positive change to the Empire. In another, she continued walking the path as a witcher, traveling the world with Geralt, hunting monsters and helping people, living the life she had always dreamed of. This latter ending appears to have been confirmed as the canonical path in the announcement of The Witcher 4, which features Ciri as a fully fledged witcher. However, in another possible outcome within the game, based on different choices that undermined Ciri's confidence and faith in herself, she did not survive her battle with the White Frost. She gave everything she had to save the world, and the effort consumed her. Geralt, devastated, could only mourn the daughter he had gained and lost. In this version, he returned to Crookback Bog, to the place where Ciri had once faced the crones, and he killed the last of them, retrieving her medallion. Then, surrounded by monsters, his ultimate fate remained uncertain. Cirilla, the lion cub of Cintra, lived many lives in her time. She was a princess of a fallen kingdom. She was a student of witches and sorceresses. She was a survivor of unspeakable trauma. She was a killer and a savior. She traveled between worlds and through time itself. She carried within her the power to save or destroy reality. But perhaps most importantly, she was a person who made her own choices, even when destiny and prophecy and the expectations of powerful figures tried to dictate her path. She was shaped by those around her, by Geralt's patient teaching, by Yennefer's fierce love, by Vesemir's wisdom, by the rat's damaged companionship, by every person she encountered and every trial she endured. Her story is not a simple one of good triumphing over evil. It is complex and ambiguous, filled with moral gray areas and impossible choices. It is a story of survival and growth, of learning to accept power without being consumed by it, of finding family among those who share no blood, but share something deeper. Whether she ended her journey as an empress bringing peace to an empire, as a witcher following in Geralt's footsteps, or as a martyr who saved the world at the cost of her own life, Ciri's story remains one of the most compelling in the Witcher universe. She is the swallow, the lion cub of Cintra, the lady of time and space, and she has earned every title through trials that would have broken lesser souls. Her story reminds us that destiny is not fixed, that prophecy can be fulfilled in unexpected ways, and that the most important power anyone can wield is the power to choose who they will become, despite what the world tries to make them. In the end, Cirilla was not defined by the elder blood in her veins, or the kingdoms that claimed her as their own. She was defined by the choices she made, the people she loved, and the person she chose to be.